What's going on? This is Ryan with Automatic Comics, and up next we're going to be talking about what's going on in the comic market right now, the trends I'm seeing, and even a little bit of what I'm seeing with my own personal sales. So stay tuned. Alright, before we get started, please remember to hit that like button and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this. These last 2 weeks of sales that I've been watching have been on a pretty decent downtrend, with this most recent week being the biggest drop that I've seen since I started recording data back in April. So we're continuing to see mixed signals. Just prior to this, the prior 2 weeks, I had seen an uptick, and now we're heading back down again. So it's hard to say exactly what might be causing this. Is this just that we're getting into the middle of summer, and so we're getting into that traditional lull period, the low period for comic sales? These last 2 weeks also overlapped with the first and last weekend, so July 4th and 11th of that holiday, and so you've got people traveling, you have less people bidding, available to buy those books, that kind of thing. So is that why we saw decreased sales? Or is it just this is a continuation of this general pullback that we've been seeing kind of to a new baseline for these comic book prices? Now, I could tell this week was going to be bad as I was watching. Now, I know I've said that before, and one time it tricked me. I thought it looked like it was going to be bad, and it wasn't, but this week I just saw sale after sale just not quite hitting the numbers that I was expecting. And again, like I said, if this is something that could be related to the holiday, if there's one or two less bidders there bidding, you're going to have one or two less people adding a bid on top of that book, one or two less people interested in that book, and that could be what's causing that. Or, like I said, just could be a continuation of that general pullback. Now, from my personal sales experience over this time period, over these last couple months, I am selling less books right now than I was selling 3 months ago. I'm just not seeing as many sales. However, my prices are quite a bit higher. So I'm actually seeing very good returns on my books, but they are starting to decline a little bit. The peak for me that I was seeing was in May. I saw a little drop in June, and then a little bit bigger drop so far in July. But it's still much stronger than it was in, say, the first 3 months of the year. So January, February, March, April, May, June, and now July have been much stronger in terms of sales prices. So yes, we might be seeing a decline in these sales, but overall, the sales prices are still quite a bit stronger. So for me, this points to what I've been discussing before, where we saw a really rapid increase in prices. You know, everything just shot straight up, and it probably overshot where the prices really were going to go to, just with all the excitement and everything, and that was May. May was where we saw this big overshoot in prices. Now we're starting to see this little bit of a decline, and I think it's getting to a point where we're going to start leveling off. Now, we'll see. I don't think we're going to get back to anywhere near the prices we were at 3 to 6 months ago. I think that those are just gone, but I am definitely seeing that pullback in the area of 10 to 20, even sometimes 30% in a lot of these really hot books that spiked a ton over that about month to 2 month period between April and May. So just a quick recap for what I do with these videos. I watch the weekly Heritage comic auction, and then I identify usually between around 150 and 200 books, key issues that I'm interested in watching that week. And these cross all ages and genres. And then I estimate the price that I think that book is going to sell for. I also capture the prior high sale for that book in that grade. And then I use this information to identify how I think comic sales are performing this week and long term. Now, I started this near the end of April. I wish I would have started earlier so I could have seen what it looked like with the big spike in prices from January until around May. But this is what I have for right now, and so I've got these all charted out for each week. So this is the graph that I've put together with these different numbers, and each of these lines tells me something. So the dark blue, green, and purple lines are all telling me about the strength of the market week to week. So if I see continuously dropping numbers or continuously low numbers, that tells me things are getting worse week after week. If I see continuously strong numbers, that tells me that things are getting better week after week. Now, you can see that these last 2 weeks have been on a downtrend, and this last week was a big drop. And I even saw again a crossover between that green line and that purple line. And so the green line is the number of sales that I saw that exceeded my estimate by 20% or more, and the purple line is the number that were lower than my estimate by 20% or more. And generally I've been seeing that green line above the purple line. And when that crosses over, it tells me we're starting to get back to the point where we're seeing more weak sales. And so those are definitely points that I want to watch, because that first crossover was in the beginning of June, and that was right when I started seeing the prices start to decline across the board. And so the second crossover might be telling us something as well. So just something that I'm keeping an eye out for. Now, the light blue line, another one that had a really big drop this week, that's what I'm using to tell me the strength of the comic market long term. This is the number of new high sales. And so this was a big drop this week. It was 33% of the books that I watched hit new highs, and that still sounds like a really good number. I mean, 33% of sales hitting all new highs, I mean, you can't really call that weak. That is a strong number, but compared to what I've been seeing historically, that is weak. For the last 2.5 months, that number has generally been at 50% or higher, and then all of a sudden we get a big drop down into the low 30s. And so I would expect, if we're in a really weak comic market, that number's probably going to be quite a bit lower than that, somewhere in the 10 to 20% range. But because you're always going to have something hitting a new high, somebody excited about some book, but still seeing 30% of those, I don't think it's a weak number, but it's definitely telling us that things are getting weaker, that a lot of those new high sales that we got back in May and June, we're just not breaking those numbers again right now. And this all aligns with what I've really been seeing week to week as I'm pricing these books. I've noticed prices dropping between around 10 and 30%, like I had said. And that's not a disaster. I know some people might think that sounds like it's terrible, but prices are up 100, 200, 300% for a lot of these books. So coming down 10, 20, 30%, even 50% really isn't that big of a deal, unless you bought at the peak. If you bought at the peak, then yes, you're probably a little frustrated or a little concerned about the prices. But if you're looking at the long-term view of the comic market, so we're talking about years, comic prices have historically been pretty flat, and we saw this big spike, and it really just seems like things are retreating a little bit back to a new baseline. But that's why I like to watch this week after week to really get a good idea of what's going on. Alright, now let's talk about some trends that I saw in this last week. Now, like you saw in the chart, these last 2 weeks have been in a downtrend for 3 of the indicators that I watch, and this last week it was down for all 4 of them. So definitely seeing that overall downtrend in prices the last couple weeks. But like I said, this overlapped with the 4th of July, and when you're talking about auctions, it really is all about who's there and who's bidding. And if people are out on vacation not bidding, that's where you could really see those steep declines. So I'll want to really watch what goes on the next couple weeks to see if we have a snapback in those prices or if we continue to see this downtrend. And like I talked about with the long-term market, we saw some crazy jumps in prices, so a pullback is very normal. And like I've said before, I am always buying and selling books, so I'm continuing to do the same thing, and that causes me to be able to pick books up at really good prices, sell at really good prices, buy it sometimes a little bit higher prices, but I'm just always generally buying and selling. It's not something that I'm really concerned about, and with what I'm seeing right now, I'm not concerned that we're at the edge of some cliff or something like that, so I am definitely still buying and selling books. So just kind of an idea for what I'm doing, because I like to be open about that. I'm not trying to influence anybody one way or the other, but I am still buying and selling books today, and you can tell that from my unboxing videos that I do regularly that I am still picking up quite a few books. And whenever you see those large unboxings, that means that I've also sold a lot of books, because that's where I get the money to make those purchases. Now, one thing I thought I'd point out that I thought was pretty interesting is that the last few weeks I've noticed that Heritage has been selling way more raw books than they ever have before, than I've ever seen. And I've been watching pretty much every Heritage auction for the last, 2.5 years, maybe a little more than that. Because typically their auctions are predominantly graded books, very few raws, an occasional raw thrown in there. But this week especially, just tons of raws. And I don't like the raw books quite as much for pricing data because they're a little harder to price and predict where they're going to go. But I think this tells us two things that are pretty interesting. The first is that I think this means that those delays with CGC are really starting to impact how Heritage is doing business with comics. They're selling them raw instead of waiting 4 to 6 months to get those books back. So it shows really how that delay that we're seeing in these grading companies is really starting to impact the comic market as a whole and how books are being sold. Now, I mentioned this in the sales video that I did, how I've noticed the prices of raws are getting very close to the prices of graded books, sometimes even more. And I've got an example. In this week's Heritage auction, there was a 6.5 raw XMen number 12 that sold for $2,880. And that's higher than a graded 6.5 has ever sold for. And if you looked at the book, maybe it was a little nicer than a 6.5, maybe it was undergraded a bit. It could have been a 7.0, but I don't think it was a 7.5, definitely not an 8. And a 7.0 hasn't even hit those numbers. And a 7.5 sold for $2,360 2 weeks ago. So you can see the logic might be that if someone says, well, hey, if I can list this book raw and not have to have the time and money spent to get that book graded, why don't I? If I can sell it for as much or more, why don't I just sell it raw and I don't have to deal with all of that? And so I think that is something that's pretty interesting that I've been seeing, just way more raws selling, the time not being spent getting the books graded. So I don't think that means it's the end of grading or anything like that. For many people, grading is very important because it really tells you the value of that book from that third party. And people are going to trust Heritage a little bit more because they do have graders that work for them. And so they're going to trust that that grader is going to give them an accurate depiction of that book. But still, at XMen 12, when I saw that one sell, it was a crazy number. It was selling about at between a 7.5 and an 8 grade. So if you think about that, if that person got that book graded, they probably would have made less money on it. So just something to think about with some of these raw books that we're seeing out there. So like I've said in the past, grading is extremely important. You need to be able to evaluate those books on your own, and then you can see if you think that that value is there at the grade that somebody has assessed it at. Maybe it's worth a little more, maybe it's worth less. All right, now I've been talking about some similar titles for the last few weeks just to kind of give an idea of how things have been changing over time, and I'm going to continue talking about those right now. The first one is Amazing Spider-Man. So 2 weeks ago, there were 15 books that sold above my estimate, with 5 that were 20% or more, and 10 that went below my estimate, 4 that were 20% or more below. So pretty strong for Spider-Man 2 weeks ago. But this week, you'd see that big drop. This week was not good for Spider-Man. 2 books went above my estimate, only 1 20% or more, and 10 books went below my estimate, with 2 going 20% or more below. So 2 weeks ago was actually relatively strong for Spider-Man. This week was a big drop. But what I did is I also then took a closer look at those sales. And the fact that there were only 2 that went 20% or more, many of those sales that went below my estimate were just a little bit below, 10% or less. So it's actually pretty close to the estimate. So while the numbers look like it was a big drop, it's not that much. So it means that my estimates were very close to what they ended up being, but the sales were just a little bit lower. And that's the thing where if you have 1 or 2 less bidders, maybe that one more bidder would have bumped it up and you have the sale beating that estimate. So that's why I think it's really going to be important to see what happens as we get outside of this holiday time period. Now, the next one that I would like to watch is Fantastic Four. 2 weeks ago, there weren't very many books for sale in this auction. I only followed 4 of them, and 0 went above my estimate, and 4 went below, with all 4 going 20% or less. And then this week, I watched 15 books. 2 went above my estimate, only 1 more than 20%, and 13 went below my estimate, with 7 going 20% or more below. So there has been some definite weakness in Fantastic Four over the last couple weeks, with a bunch of them selling for 20% or below my estimates. So we're really seeing some big pullbacks in Fantastic Four. And I've mentioned this before with big keys like Fantastic Four 48, 49, 52. they had just been up a ton, just really spiked over the last few months, 250, 300%. And so seeing pullbacks in those books, I'm not really all that surprised. It's very normal to start to see a little bit of a decline after those really high prices. So if you're in the market for some of these Fantastic Four keys, now might really be the time to go after them, because one thing I've really learned is that you only get so many chances to get books at a discount to market. And if this is the time to be looking at Fantastic Four, and that's a book you're interested in getting, any of these big keys, now might be the time to start really looking for those books and trying to pick them up. Now, with that, just one thing I really wanted to comment on. I know that some people hate comics being treated like the stock market, but really, whether you like it or not, a lot of the same principles really do apply, and if you aren't paying attention to that, it can really be at a loss to yourself, when you're buying and selling books. And so when you see a time when prices are dropping, looks like some people are afraid and they're selling, but there really isn't any reason to be worried. There's really no outside activity going on right now in comics that would cause these to drop. We've got a Fantastic Four movie, for example, with Fantastic Four that's coming up, and so that's when you should really consider buying. And that's what I do when I see sale prices dropping. That's when I'm buying those books. So that's really what I would recommend for other people as well. If you're starting to see weakness, then that's when you should be picking up those books. That's when you get that chance to buy those books. If you're always waiting, then eventually those prices will probably just jump right back up. Then you missed your chance to get that book at a discount. So you can see from my unboxings, I have been buying a lot lately. So I'm taking advantage of these chances because, like I mentioned earlier, you really don't get those chances very often. And so when you see them, you've got to take them. Now, the last run of books that I'd like to talk about is XMen. And 2 weeks ago, 5 went above my estimate with 5 more than 20%. And 4 went below my estimate with 0 going 20% or more below. And then this week, 8 went above my estimate with 4 going over 20%, and 8 went below with only 3 going 20% or more below. So I'm actually continuing to see good numbers with XMen, even in this weaker period. And so if you've watched my prior videos, XMen had been really weak for over a month. They had been the ones that really moved first, so they saw those peak high prices before any of the other books, and then they started to retreat earlier, and just week after week it was bad sales for XMen. But my last video, and now this one, I started seeing a turn. I started seeing XMen books selling above my estimates as often or more often than selling below. So I really think that XMen has started to turn that corner, is starting to reach that point where it's leveling off, and that's why I'm starting to see these even numbers week after week. Now, if you're looking for XMen books and you've been waiting for prices to drop, I think that that's telling us that we really are at where those prices are coming down to. So if you're looking to pick one up, now is probably the time to do it. Maybe they aren't going to drop so much anymore after this, and we're going to start to see some increases again. For example, that's what I started to see with XMen #1. It took a really big drop over the last maybe month and a half, and it's started to level off. I've noticed that those prices have started to come back up even a little bit, so if you're looking for XMen books, now might be the time to get them. Now, I've also generally like to talk about other trends that I see, if I see any, within that sales data. And like you saw from the chart, last week was pretty bad across the board. XMen was a bright spot, but one set of books that I had been talking about for the last few videos that had just been going really well was PreCode Horror. But this week, PreCode Horror was very bad. The sales on PreCode Horror were not good at all. And I think that part of the reason for that was there were just a ton of PreCode Horror books in this sale. It was like they had a collection maybe that got picked up that was being sold that had almost every EC horror book that exists. They were just shock suspense stories, crime suspense stories, Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, just all of them in almost every book from those runs. And I think maybe what had happened was it got a little overwhelmed because PreCode Horror, while yes, I think it is very popular right now, you are still in kind of a niche market. You're only going to have so many people that are buying those books at any given auction. And I think maybe Heritage overplayed their hand a little bit on this one, releasing them all in a single auction, and ended up overwhelming the number of people that were there to buy them. And so you saw some really, really weak sales in those books. Because for me, I don't think that this signals the end to the love of PreCode Horror books. I mean, completely the opposite. I think that's part of why we saw so many being sold, is that people are seeing that there is so much interest in them. I just think that it was a bit of a mistake in dropping all those so much volume in a single auction. And like I said, I think that PreCode Horror is really strong, so I definitely took advantage of that. I bought quite a few PreCode Horror books in this auction. So as I mentioned earlier, you take advantage of those times that you see things come up for a sale, because you just don't get those options all that often. So kind of my overall view of how the comic market is going right now, these last 2 weeks definitely were a step down, but I don't think that necessarily means prices are going back to where they were. For me, this is when it's a really good time to actually start looking for books that you're interested in, looking for books that you want to pick up when you see this kind of weakness. So keep your eyes open. If you're in the market for any type of key book, especially Fantastic Four or say X-Men, then now might be the right time to start looking for them. So this is normally when I would jump into talking about some of the shocking high and low sales from this week, but the videos are just getting a little too long, a lot of time to edit them, and so I decided to break it out into a separate video. And so you'll see that video drop sometime after this one, and so it's just going to be kind of like a top 10 video where I've got my 5 sales that were surprising on the high end and 5 sales surprising on the low end. So keep your eyes open for that. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this. I've got videos over here that you can click on if you'd like to watch those, and the subscription button right here if you click that. I'd really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next video.